Okay, welcome to the 35th episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm delighted to be speaking to Carl Chambers. Carl is a Church of England Vicar at St Michael and All Angels Church in Wilmington, Kent. He is passionate about giving voice and shining light on issues in the church. So welcome, Carl.
Hi, Piers. Great to be here. Thank you also for your podcast. I stumbled on them about a month or two ago and found them helpful, encouraging, actually somewhat therapeutic too. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure. How did it happen? I think it was during the beginning of lockdown and I was getting emails from people saying how they were struggling. So I was like, okay, how can I support? So I started to reach out to people and friends and interview people and it just snowballed. So 2 years later, here we go.
Well done. Keep on going.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd love, and this is how I begin most of my my podcast, is I'd love for you to share a little bit about your own journey into getting where you are now. What led you into the church?
What led me into the church? So I think I was a religious teenager. I went to boarding school. We might come on to this, but as a prep school, and I never had a problem with believing there was a God. So chapel was always something that I kind of knew was right. You know, it was the old English version, and you'd stand up for hymns and all of that. But there was a God-fearingness in me. And later on, I went to a day school, a secondary school, but still had that God-fearingness, which I think I cloaked with a religiosity, going to church, thinking I was trying to be good, although my Saturdays playing rugby and partying afterwards were never quite the same as Sunday morning when I'd say sorry, so to speak. Anyone who's been a teenager will know that. And at the end of my teenage, I kind of thought, well, if God is really putting up with me living this way, which is basically a complete hypocrite, then he must be a bit of a foolish God. And I gave up on church. I gave up on any pretense, until about halfway through university, and actually a rugby injury meant that I had Sunday mornings free, and stumbled back to church. And someone very kindly said, well, let's talk about things to do with God. Taught me actually that he showed me that I'd been spending the whole of my life trying to be good enough for God, and that in Jesus you can never be good enough for God, but God has given us Jesus that we might be good enough in his sight. Be good enough meaning be acceptable, be friends with God, be reconciled, be brought back. And that was just wonderful news. I'd never heard it. And I wanted to know more, and so sort of became a Christian, in terms of someone who understands that being a Christian isn't about being good. It's about saying, Jesus, you are God, and I want to follow you. I'm not good, and that's why I need to follow you. So that's how I became a Christian. And then really it was over a number of years. I was involved in business, which I really loved. Traveled actually across the world as a young man. That was just brilliant, but would find myself time and again enjoying or planning my business trips, so I'd come back to do a youth group on a Friday night. I was taking my holiday doing Christian work as well. So at the end of the day, you've only got one life, and I found myself enjoying teaching the Bible so people can know how much God loves them. I enjoyed that more even than trying to earn a living making money selling chemicals in South America. So that kind of led me into church work, but rooted in that sense of thinking I want to be in a church where people can know that there's a welcoming, a loving God who accepts us for who we are, and then wants us to come in Jesus and under him. That's a slightly longer version of a 1 minute answer, but potted 40 50 years of history.
Well, thank you. Fascinating. It's interesting. And I was saying before we started recording, I was sure as we started the conversation how our journeys would overlap. And like business, I went to business school and I traveled the world, and yet also I found what I was searching for out there was within me, and I was looking at all these places. So yeah, interesting, that thing of traveling and business. So so I one of the reasons I reached out to you, it was one of my subscribers probably 2 or 3 months ago. He'd seen a podcast with Peter Sandlin on it, and he says, "Oh, I think you should get this person on it." So I reached out, and Peter says, "Well, I'm not doing podcasts," and eventually we kind of connected. And I guess one of my kind of interests really is about the church. And the second question is really about cover up. There's been a lot of cover up, around the church, and issues like safeguarding and abuse. And I guess the first question is really, why do you feel this is the case? Why has there been such a cover up? I was watching Spotlight, the movie a few months ago, which is about the Boston Globe, exposing what went on in the church there. And it's like the same story, cover up. So why do you feel this is the case?
Yeah, it's even the phrase cover up is one that I think some people will deny. I've certainly heard people in the last 2 or 3 years deny any cover up concerning people who are clearly abusive within the church. In fact, one of the a significant abuser who was a minister of a church in south of London, about whom there was a report written, said to me, there has been no cover up, and has written the same within the minimal contact we had. So I a few weeks ago, I happened to watch something on about Jimmy Savile, and there was just blatant institutional cover-up, indifference, ignorance. He got away with it because he could. I think institutions often think it's someone else's problem. If they don't have the welfare of individuals at the center of their life and being, then they're more concerned with reputation and the like. And that allows cover up because people don't really want to, they don't want to face the truth. They don't want to face the truth about actually our own selves. I think many ministers, it would be really interesting to do a survey of how many people know that their vicar, for instance, is good at saying sorry. Because my experience is that that's not common, and actually Christians ought to be people who are who find it, we don't like saying sorry because we acknowledge we've done wrong, but we acknowledge that we have done wrong. So I think starting even with our own selves, we can cover up in our own lives. We have secrets that we don't want others to know about. I guess that's true for so many. And then more broadly, we don't want our friend who we like, maybe we've invested in, maybe who has invested in us, we don't want to allow them or to dob them in it, so to speak. We're sure it's not quite as bad as it could be. I mean, the world is finding out now that Putin is as bad as people have been saying for decades. And we haven't quite wanted to believe it. So there's the individual, there's the relational of those we know, and then there's the I've heard of this, but I don't really know the person, I don't really know the people, and I'm not really very interested. I'm not curious because I don't know them. They're not on my radar. So we're moving out on the levels of all of those are areas which allow cover up because people don't step in and go, yeah, I need to deal with it on my own. I need to deal with people I know. I need to not be afraid of just saying, hey, mate, was that right? Or picking up the phone to someone who I've barely met, or writing to them, visiting them, and thinking, hey, is that really true? And then all of that, added all together, and you get the institution which says we are here for this purpose. That's not part of our core purpose. And I mean, tragically, in the church, that's been the case, when you really would have thought the church's core purpose is to help others, and particularly those in greatest need, so the weakest. And actually we'll all be part of that, because we've all got weaknesses, and so institutionally, I'm building the layers, but you can see where it's easy to just to allow cover up to happen through ignorance, indifference, fear, that they're all there. And I guess the heart of it is not saying this is wrong, and that shouldn't be happening, and then being concerned for the person who has been wronged, and giving them voice to say, tell me about it. I'm really sorry. From the little you've told me, I've heard of, tell me about what's happened. I can't even necessarily promise to help, but I want to listen and understand how you've been hurt. I want to weep with you, if you would allow me. I'll conclude with, I actually think that sometimes people who've suffered really would struggle to trust people to listen to them. And so actually maybe we feel we're not going to be trusted, or people don't speak out because they've spoken out before and no one's heard them, and therefore they won't hear them this time. That all contributes to cover up. So it's a very, very broad phrase, but the way we get around it is to say, no, let's shine the light. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as lots of people say in lots of ways, and it's true here. Speak, give your voice. Let's let the truth shine. If you've done something wrong, you can be forgiven. There may be consequences, but the first thing to acknowledge is you've done something wrong.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm wondering, as you're speaking, this sense of shame about speaking up. I have a friend who received sexual abuse at one of the leading boarding schools, and he went to the ICSA, and he felt a bit, quite a bit of shame, partly because the way that it was dealt with. At one point, his statement was put up online without his consent, and it was like, whoa, this is already difficult enough, and therefore when people don't get consent, and he says it was very, and he's in a good space, but almost this sense of, I don't want to speak up because this is very tender.
And so I think one of the problems of people knowing how to say an appropriate sorry, and I don't know your case, but that when we do something, it actually has a much bigger impact often than we realize. And so ICSA, for instance, I don't know if they did, but an appropriate response will be to acknowledge they should never have done that, and then to be 100 times clearer, we will never do this. And we've got systems to ensure that we never do this. And we anonymize and then re-anonymize, or whatever it is. And to acknowledge and to hold your hands up and say, look, I got it wrong. I'm terribly sorry. And this is what I'm doing to deal with it. And to make sure it doesn't happen again, because that way I acknowledge that it was very, very wrong.
Thank you. And I almost hear it's like sometimes it's hundreds of little white lies that then lead on to the big one. Almost that, well, I've just been saying this little thing, and actually it's almost like we need that real honesty in our day-to-day life. I messed up, oh, I've just broken this cup. But it's almost like we live in a world where we can, oh, it's just, I'm just taking that from company. It doesn't matter. It's just a little thing. They don't notice, and it just gradually builds up.
And the same is also to show that we are receptive for being corrected. And I think often we can put up barriers, and to sort of send the message again. I know of people who, I've been told, well, you can't really raise this with them because they'll never say sorry. I'll give a personal example of something rather. I was involved in an emailing and a disclosing of a report that had happened to someone that I won't go into details, but actually one of the people came back to me and said, look, Carl, just to let you know, thank you for what you've done ABC right, but by the way, there is the potential that you might have disclosed the name of someone and therefore their abuse by what you've just done. Here is what you should have done in its place. And I was really, really grateful because there was categorically no intent of disclosing someone's abuse, but actually to be corrected, to say, look, have you thought about this? Because you could have done, was a really helpful reminder. And I guess that we're all going to be in situations where that sort of thing happens. That none of us gets 100% all the time. But I was able to say to the person, thank you so much. That's really important. By the way, I'm copying this into other people who need to know that this was a hiccup. Great, let's learn from it and not move on, but move on wiser.
Yeah, so I'm hearing this ability to be really courageous to receive feedback and to not go, whoa, no, not my fault, but actually go, oh, thank you, to hear what someone else is feeding back to us.
Yeah, I think that's it's important. It's lovely you use the word courageous. It's something we need to learn and to grow in. It's part of a relationship with ourselves, with each other, to be able to speak truth in love and to hear it.
Yeah, thank you. As you were speaking, there's some other kind of side shoots I could go down, but I will stay to the questions. So I guess, you've started to answer this, but the next question really was about how do we shine light on these issues and bring healing to those who have been affected by some of these wrongdoings in the church?
Thank you. Well, lots of different ways, I think. Actually, part of what you're doing here is helpful. It's giving voice to those who've suffered, to say, do you know what, actually, a few years back, we went through particularly, I think it was a structurally abusive situation. And actually for people to say, I believe you, that was wrong. That shouldn't have happened. Just if you've suffered, for someone to say that is really affirming. The person who says it is doing nothing more than acknowledging what's happened. But actually the person who's hearing it can, there's a healing there. It's shining light. It's knowing that I've been believed. I'm not alone. That yes, this really, really was bad. Plenty of abusive situations will, an abused spouse will just needs to know that this was very, very wrong. And people care about them in that situation. So I think talking about it, allowing people to have voice, I think that could be on different levels. I would often, encourage people just to have a curiosity, which means obviously if you know about someone who suffered, to say, tell me, how are you? I'm sorry you have. Talk to me. I may not be able to answer to resolve all your problems, but at least I want to listen. And then equally to have a curiosity to say, well, tell me I've heard of this. I'm really sorry. Tell me about it. If there is that kind of potential contact, often we can be afraid to reach out to folk. But actually, I think when we've suffered, we don't mind talking about it. If we trust the other person. And then institutionally, those with power, so to speak, so people in leadership of whatever organizations need to make sure that the system, the mechanic of their institution provides voice that cares for people who've suffered rather than crushes. And that needs a building of trust, that needs, going out of your way. Probably, those particularly in leadership need to take extra steps to say, I'm gonna come and I'll meet with you, I'll talk with you. It doesn't need to be public. The sort of social media, newspapers, all of that can often be really unhelpful. You know what, we're human beings, just having a coffee with someone, doing what we're doing here, if the distance is too great. Those are good things. So shining the light in, and it's, do you know what, it will be living with this in 30 years. I regret, but this will just morph into other things. The great trouble is that we've got decades of history of abuse that's not been acknowledged, and that's terrible. So we've got a long time to address it, or a lot to address, and it will take us a long time too.
I think Alex Renton said 1 out of 10 abuse survivors in his book Stiff Upper Lip, that they're the only 1 in 10 will come forward, 9 out of 10 don't. So it's like, and it's interesting, in my own boarding school, a couple of years ago, a few people came forward and spoke up about the priest and other teachers, and and obviously I was at school 30 years ago, and it's just kind of come forth now. So it's like, yeah, I get a sense that these things will be opening up for a number of years. But I like that sense of, having someone hear you, listen, I believe you, having a space to talk about it. I love Nick Duffell's work with the boarding school survivors. Just a weekend where you can just hear other people's stories is so powerful. And yeah, the leadership, having that courage to actually speak to someone. Yeah, I reached out a few weeks ago to the author of this book called A Black Boy at Eton. And he basically spoke up about the abuse he had got at Eton, and the headmaster in 1972, when the book came out, he banned him from the school. It was only Black Lives Matter 2020, they issued an apology to say, sorry, you can come back now. And it's like, yeah, if you can have someone in leadership going, okay, we messed up 40 years ago, now we can, or 50 years ago, we can do something about it.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry, and banning you 40 years ago will have had an impact on your life. I'm sorry, not just for banning you, but I'm sorry for the hurt that it's caused throughout that life. Please help me understand how much I've hurt you, because the hurt wasn't just in the banning. The hurt was in the living out of 40 years of cover-up, of denial, of saying we've crushed someone and who are they? Who cares? I don't know the book, but that's where institutions and relationships that allow people to talk and recognize that it's not just the event, it's all that's followed up from that, the consequences of having suffered.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. So, my fourth question, which we've kind of really covered about, my question was, is there any light that you can shine and speak about? What is it that we are not talking about? I think we've kind of touched on it, but is there anything else in there that we do need to go, you know what? Yeah, we're not talking about this, or
what are we not talking about? Yeah, I don't know, by the way, I don't know if sort of listeners are working out. You did kindly send me a few questions beforehand to get me thinking about. So that's where the questions are there. What are we not talking about? I think we're not talking about the depths of how much people can suffer. Mm-hmm. So we think that, if you were hit, I'm being very, very pejorative here, but if you're hit, then it's not just that momentary pain, because you've been hit in a system which has allowed that, and then allowed the person to get away with it, and then caused you to have to deny that it's happened. So that's the system that we're not talking about sufficiently, I think I'd say. And I would also add to that I think we're not talking about the place of the many, not just the few who will have caused the specific harm. Mm-hmm. So we are corporately responsible for having allowed a system to survive that has allowed the perpetrator to do what they've done. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot more work to be done there in terms of what it is for the place of your average person who just has been indifferent and shown no curiosity, and kind of thinks, well, look, this is nothing to do with me. I didn't know who they were. They were in a different year of my school, and I never saw it happening, and I only heard rumors. And no, what does it mean for that kind of person? They're not an innocent bystander. They're part of the corporate mass that has enabled this to happen, because if they've heard of it, they could have said something. Mm-hmm. And we will deal with that throughout life, throughout our cultures. Just come to mind, I was in touch with a friend in South Africa yesterday. So, the apartheid system, many white people were very opposed to apartheid, but didn't have the power, or didn't feel they had the power. Or were happy to go along with what happened whilst protesting. Those are horrible generalities. I'm speaking only in that, and ditto in other areas in our own country. We see the same in Russia, actually. How much are people really opposed to or supporting of the war? How much do they know? So, what are we not talking about? Let's talk more.
Yeah. Let's talk more. Yeah,
and with gentleness, not without condemnation, with acknowledging what is wrong. Part of thinking through some of the questions, because was just thinking, I'm always thinking, are there any people who are at the school I went to as a prep school who will have seen me as a bully, and who might listen to this? Because I really genuinely don't think I was much, apart from being part of the system and what have you. But I may well have been. And in fact, now it's just coming to mind, my mum told me once, she was a teacher. She died a few years ago, but she'd been teaching at a school where, from my first primary school, children went. And she ended up sitting next door to someone at lunch and said, "Oh, hello, I'm Mrs. Chambers." And she said, "Oh," the girl said, "I know." And my mum went, "Why?" She said, "Oh, your son was in my class. He used to frighten me with spiders when I was 5, which I never remembered doing when I was 11 or 12, when my mum told me that. So what other, and I was horrified that I'd done it. And yet, how many other ones of things have we done that but we don't even know how sorry we should be for.
Yeah. And I almost feel, thank you for sharing your honesty. I almost feel that, it's because I felt the same myself. I was quite passive aggressive. I didn't specifically bully people, but I bullied people by just my anger. It's like, you just keep away from me. That's threat of violence, that, you come near me, I will hit you. I never, very rarely did. But it wasn't nice being around me. Not until, well, some would say even now, sometimes I could be grumpy. And it was almost like that was my caricature that I put in place to set, protect me from my father, but then at boarding school from other people. Open dorm, how do we protect ourselves? And we're not taught by the adults or the teachers to go, we have this way of behaving. It was like, just leave them to it.
And that's really interesting, because that word bully, I'm not an expert, but what you've just described may not be actually bullying. I don't know all the details, but it might just be you were passive aggressive, but because you weren't involved, that wasn't out and out bullying. I don't know. And yet there was some tension in the relationship that affected the relationship. And so sometimes our labeling of this is wrong can get in the way of acknowledging that this is wrong. So a sensitivity and an understanding of actually saying, look, yeah, we can label it if we want, but actually you don't have to define this as bullying to say, look, you affected me, you hurt me by your passive aggressiveness. I was afraid of you. And that had an impact. That will happen in day-to-day life in a whole variety of ways. And to give us the chance to acknowledge where we've hurt someone, where we've damaged a relationship. Here we go back to my sort of Christian principles of ultimately, if anything God has done is sent Jesus that our relationship that was broken might be restored with him. So we're in the process in that we exist for restoring, reconciling relationships. A very good and godly thing. So for the ability to talk about it without fear of labels, of condemnation, because actually I don't want to pounce on you and say, oh, you are a passive aggressive bully. That actually stops you from saying, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And I want to make it easier for you to say sorry. Because actually the easier it is then for someone to say, yeah, but you really did hurt me. You really, really did hurt me.
And I get a sense thinking about it that I used to sit at the head of the table as an 17-year-old, and there were people at the bottom who got very little food, and they used to stare at me and kind of scowl because I should have made sure they got enough food. And I'm sure these people who, if they are listening to this, they'd go, you weren't a nice person. So I guess as you're speaking, I'm wondering, is there something within the church, like, Desmond Tutu did in South Africa, like a reconciliation, where he went round South Africa and they did singing, and then people talked about what had gone on in apartheid. Is there something like that which happens in the UK or globally around what's been happening in the church, that people who have been abused can come into a safe space, and they can just be heard?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know if ICSA was the beginnings of an attempt for that, but it clearly wasn't the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the same way. I actually, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking with a friend and saying we need just that. I think we need a body that, we do need a body of people who are trained and equipped, on the one hand, to be really forensic in understanding what has happened. So not just giving voice, but really prosecuting in the sense of digging in and trying to understand properly. There are organizations that do that. There's one in the US that is very forensic. They have police officers involved. A friend of mine, a police officer, knows about abuse and was really quite strong with me as we engaged, saying the church in this country needs that. But then there's also the healing side, which is another sort of, I'm going to say, within a church, just to pick one institution. So some people go in forensically and can understand what's really happened, and filter the look, he was just a bit brusque, to that's really wrong and abusive. But that's important because we're all going to be brusque at times. Not that we shouldn't say sorry for that. But the healing side then is, okay, how do we recover? How do we grow out of this? How do we enable each other to say sorry and to hear that and to appreciate it and to acknowledge it? I think there's a real space for that. As to help, I'm going to be specific, to help churches where the minister has been abusive, to come together. I've done some reading on this. So there are people who've written about it, but actually, are there people who are trained and then beginning to be practiced and experience, is I think a big lack. If anyone listening in wants to help, you know where to contact me. But it's something that really, for the next decade, we need to have both those groups. And more widely, I'm just going to throw in that I think, Jimmy Savile wasn't just in one spot. Part of his cleverness, I hesitate to use that word, but was that he played people off against each other. The reason that you got in touch with Peter Sandlin was that he was talking about someone called John Smythe, who abused, not at Winchester College. There's been reports written about that, but not just there. He abused or used Ewan schools, which are some top public schools, as a sort of recruiting ground. So he played people off against each other. Others have done that within the Ewan schools network, I'm sorry to say. That one person had a report written about him. He's this chap in a church in South London. And it wasn't just one spot. And actually, it's the institutions, the bodies coming together that need to say, here's an abuser who's been very clever and played people off against each other. And where is the healing that's needed there? That's more than just one local church. That's pretty broad and big. And will take even more work, but important work, to hear and to help people be heard, be believed.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting coming back to Jimmy Savile. He used to actually come here. I live in Hebden Bridge now. He used to come here on holiday. He used to have a caravan. He was friends. And my wife, when she was young, went walking on one of his charity walks up to the local pike. And it was interesting. I was listening to an interview with John Lydon from the Sex Pistols on BBC in the 70s. And he was talking up about Jimmy Savile. And he got banned after that interview.
Yeah.
And it was like, wait a minute, he's speaking up saying this is wrong, that this guy's not okay. And I'm wondering, maybe that links us into boarding school a bit. I'm wondering if a lot of boarding schools, there is that this is just normal. That's kind of, my sense with my boarding school was, well, this is just normal. There's really dodgy people here and that's okay. But it's only now when it's starting to come out in the press, it's like, no, that wasn't okay. There were things which were happening that we kind of were aware of, but we didn't know the details about. And I'm wondering if the blanket cover up of Jimmy Savile was because a lot of people in those institutions who were leading them were, had grown up in these institutions, that this was just normalized. Oh, this is just normal. You've got people like this. It's okay. Now, yeah.
And I mean, what are the things that you're taught at boarding school that aren't in the book, so to speak? Or don't sneak. Don't dob someone in. There's never a lesson about it, apart from that's the whole of your existence. Be loyal. And loyalty means don't dob someone, don't sneak, don't give them, be committed to them. They're on your side, not the other side. It's all about you, not them. And it breeds it. The inter-school rivalry means that you want to beat the other school. And every term, every Saturday, you want to beat the other school because aren't you better? And all of that sense of loyalty. We are the chosen ones. We're the elite. We are the special ones. And all of that. They're not. There's no curriculum for them, but that's just the starting point. And all of that, if you bring that into life, it's going to stop you saying, "Hey, do you know that Johnny Lydon person? Is there truth in that?" Because no, Jimmy Savile's one of us. We're not going to drop him in it. Or if he's not one of us, he's useful to us. And that's the other thing. If they're useful to us, then we'll keep them. And we'll get rid of them one day and then deny it all happened. But as long as we're getting something out of them, that's fine. It's kind of like Russian donors to the Tory party. If they're useful to us, we'll put up with it, hold our nose. I think that's the case. That it's what you're not taught, but you're bred to live out, that says you can't question. You can't say, why are we doing this? And boarding school is particularly challenging, unhelpful, I would suggest, is because the way I see it is this: if as human beings we're built for relationship. I think it's part of what it is to be made in the image of God, a relationship. And if we're built for relationship, my relationship with another person is a bond. Imagine we're like an atom with a little thing going out to another one. I hope that's the right chemistry, but imagine those bonds are our relationships. Now, when you're an 8-year-old, what are your bonds? Your bonds are with your mum and dad, but guess what? You don't see them much. Maybe once a week, maybe once a half term. So those bonds are no longer a strong, thick black line. They are just a faint line or a dashed line. That's when you've got a good relationship at home. And I've now got a halo because the sun is shining outside. So that's when you've got and that's probably it. You maybe wider family, but those bonds also, what are they within the school? Well, they're your friends, whoever you're in a dormitory with or whatever. But what really are they? Because it's dog eat dog in a boarding school.
It is.
It's survival of the fittest. It's kind of is how you're bred. You certainly, as a gang, are corporately picking on whoever is weaker, maybe by house. It's part of the system. Which is not to say that competition is not good. It's not to say that all of that. But actually, if those are your bonds, you're left as a very sort of weakened person. And that's going to affect the way that you relate with other people.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I could really go down some rabbit holes there. I think Nick Duffel talks about, this importance of having emotional intelligence to be a good leader. And as we know, boarding school, that's the one thing that is not allowed, emotional intelligence. I feel sad, or I want to cry, or I'm happy. and therefore what type of leader is that making, who's running the world, the country? So yeah, so I would love, because I could, that's the thing about these podcasts, they go very quickly. Yeah, so I'd love you to just share a little bit about your boarding experience. I know you went from, say, age 8. I'd love you to speak a little bit about the impact that it had for you. And I guess, what you mentioned was that when you left, you thought, oh, it was great. But then later on, it started to come in, because you left at about age 12, 13, was that right?
Yeah.
And suddenly it was like, oh, actually, maybe it wasn't as good as I thought. What changed your opinion?
Yeah, we chatted before. So I went to a prep school when I was 7. The narrative was very, very clear. I was too naughty for my primary school. My parents took me out and sort of sent me to the prep school, where I could be sort of had some discipline and also be taught really, well as well. I'm very, very grateful for that. And have the discipline of sport and things like that. Within a couple of terms, I started boarding. I was a weekly boarder. We didn't live too far away. It was 5 miles or something. But actually, I remember that phrase, weekly, because it was weakling. If you were a weekly boarder, you were a weakling. And just sort of as part of our conversations, I've sort of been thinking about it. And that's where it came back to me. You're a weakling. What does that say? It says you've got to be a full boarder, because that's where you get sweets on a Sunday, and you're obviously not a weakling. So eventually I became a full boarder, and thought I loved it. I certainly enjoyed rugby and sort of a lot of the things there. I ended up being head boy as well with someone else. So kind of on the top. And yet it was when I went to a day school thereafter. I had taken scholarships for public schools, so to speak, but my parents said no, because I didn't get any of the scholarships. I'm very thankful, because I think that would have saved me boarding throughout teenage as well. And I'm very thankful for the day school. But actually, it was when I left prep school thinking, wow, I've really hit the top. And I got to the day school, and there was something about it which I just thought I did not like prep school. And I don't know still now what exactly it was. Maybe it was the fact that I could see my parents, or hopefully most days, every day. My dad would travel, but just that bond that was a faint dotted line was now just being marked and slightly stronger from the age of 13. That sense of you could be at home, you could have a meal that you enjoyed. You still get taught really well, because it was a grammar school, but you had to fee paying. Still had great rugby, but those bonds of relationship. And I don't think the bullying was as intense, because every other child that you were with would go home to whatever parental family background they had. Don't get me wrong, at school there was still, I still look back and think boys aren't nice to boys. That didn't happen. If you start getting spots, you get picked on. I remember getting picked on. It does happen, and it's not good. But the sense of oppression wasn't there. That only looking back, I think I had, and isolation as well, that you have at a small prep school. Isolation relationally, in terms of growing emotionally and into who you are.
Thank you. It's interesting. Thank you. As you speak there, reminds me of Harry Potter. And I read Harry Potter in tears, most of it, because as I was reading it, it was very similar to my boarding school. And I remember at one point, I think it's either the fourth book, The Goblet of Fire, he gets put forward for the Goblet of Fire, and no one will speak to him. And this is for probably a couple of months. And I'm just aware that, yeah, if we were to speak up and become the outcast, there was, we couldn't go home at the end of the day and speak to mum and go, I'm really struggling. It was like you were suddenly, in Coventry. No one would speak to you. And I cried and cried when I read the fourth book, because it was like, oh, I remember that. And yet we don't psychologically think, what was the impact on someone like Harry Potter? Being totally alone, having no friends, no one would speak to him. And that's almost like the fear of speaking up, because that was huge. Like you said, it's those bonds, those relationships. If suddenly you're rejected, we wanted to do everything to stay in communication with others and not be rejected.
Yeah, no, that's right. I remember an incident where parents would be allowed up on a Wednesday afternoon after sports to whatever it was. I'd sit in the car for a time, maybe I think about an hour it was, and talk to my mum. And she gave me an apple. Probably gave me sweets as well and other stuff, but an apple, I remember. And then the next day or something, I was eating it in the playground. And a teacher came up and said, well, why are you eating that apple? I said, well, my mum gave it to me, sir. And he said, well, you're not allowed an apple. You have to have one from matron. And my response was, so what, sir? Which was just funny because I said the sir, and was very rude, because you really shouldn't be saying as a young boy, so what, to a teacher. But I was eating an apple. An apple that wasn't from matron. If it had been from matron, I would have been allowed it. But if it wasn't from matron, I wasn't allowed it. An apple. And that was reported. The headmaster at lunch the next day, or soon. I remember where I was sitting in the whole school. All the school had lunch together. I remember where I was sitting, because my friend said I turned a beetroot, as the headmaster told the whole school that someone had eaten an apple and had said, so what, to the teacher. And I'm sure there's stuff that I haven't processed even from that, because it's a snapshot of just the rules, the having to obey, the illogicality, the power, the lack of compassion. So what, sir, gets you shamed in front of the school. And that's the sense of crushing an individual, because you really learn there, you do not break the rules. Because if you do, boy, the whole school will know about it.
Yeah.
And I don't think I was named, but you don't need not to name the person. Everyone on my table knew, because the temperature rose by a couple of degrees. And then, of course, the whole school knows, because, one person just needs one person to know, and the rest of the school knows, because they tell two and they tell two.
It's that currency from school. It's like, oh, I've got a secret.
Yeah.
And it goes around the school quickly. Yeah. Interesting.
And it's a secret because, everyone's out to try and be better than someone else, because, of course, I didn't eat that apple, or they once were nasty to me, and so I'll get them back, or whatever it might be,
Yeah. Thank you. And that's kind of, I know it's not on the questions. It's kind of just linking in, because this is, I'm in discussions at the moment about making a film about the impact that boarding school has on the world, because of the leaders and the business leaders who are in these positions of power. And as you say these words, the shaming, the crushing, do not break the rules. I'm just thinking, how many times have I heard that in the last couple of years, last 2 years especially, coming from those in charge, that same crushing. And I'm just wondering what we can do as a society, that when we have people in positions of power who have unprocessed trauma and they're projecting it onto the rest of the world in shaming or crushing, what can we do? What's the solution?
I think, I mean, two or three things come to mind. One would be the word empathy, to acknowledge that people have been hurting themselves, maybe don't even realize it. And so a real gentleness there is needed. That's why I kind of said we need to make it easier for people to say sorry. We need to create an atmosphere where it's okay to acknowledge that some things are wrong. And they may not be career breaking. In the church, for instance, if you are abusive, then that really should challenge your position. But what happens if you just are a little bit rude once? That shouldn't be career breaking, because otherwise not one of us will ever survive anywhere. I'm not condoning being rude. I'm saying that we ought to be able to give someone the chance to say sorry and acknowledge that that was wrong, and say, please forgive me, and I'm sorry for the impact that this has caused on you. If you're a bit short with someone or what have you. But guess what? If you're persistently that, then that's a very different matter. And you refuse to say sorry, that's a very, very different matter. So we start with empathy, acknowledging that people can be hurt and broken. It may well be, though, that, and I certainly know this around the John Smythe situation from Winchester, from Titus Trust Ewan, that it may well be that there are some with so many unprocessed traumas that actually to take time out from ministry is important, because it's very hard to minister to others if you've got blind spots. And I think that would be, that's not for me to say who, but to say that there may well be that there are people that need that, not just abused people, but people who are carrying those traumas, as you would for any other situation. But ministry in the church particularly has a pastoral weight. Very, very simply, you won't see it. If you are unaware of what's happened, you won't be able to have the strength to help others. And we need that. So empathy with the person, combined with an acknowledgement that some things are wrong and they need to be addressed, but addressed appropriately, I think would be a beginnings of an answer. It wasn't on your list, so that's my first answer.
Yeah, thank you. It's just, I find that with conversations.
That's okay. It's good. It's good. Yeah.
Because as you're saying that, it's like, I recognize that shame and that crushing, and therefore I'm like, that's just kind of linking pieces in. So a great first answer.
But it's also worth acknowledging that at the same time, when you've suffered, it can make you that much more empathetic with others.
Yes.
So, I haven't been through every possible situation, but I know that having suffered somewhat, when people talk to me about what they've been through, what they are going through, I know to listen that bit more. I know to ask another question. I know to let them just be quiet for a while and to talk. I know to ask them again a few weeks later. So actually having experienced something doesn't need to be career breaking. It can be career, who cares about careers, but defining in the sense of help you be more of who it is good to be, who God wants me to be. But it does mean we need to process it well.
Mm, mm, mm. Thank you, Carl. So we kind of got about 10 minutes left. I mean, one of the things you shared a few days ago was this analogy regarding the church and the abuse, which we don't necessarily have to go into it now because we've spoken a bit. There's that. And then there's also the other question about vision moving forward, because I'd love to end with that, because I feel that's a really important part of leadership for me is what's our vision?
Yeah, you use that word analogy. We were chatting as for the sake of the listener, I'll describe it because actually I think there's a lot to be in it. When I left school, I was sort of 18 and I'd stayed at home. My parents went away for a week, and here I was wanting to be very grown up, and I thought I'd do some cooking, and so prepared smoked mackerel pate, which I thought I was being very clever in doing, but also as a 18-year-old who'd been somewhat sheltered, just put all the stuff to the side in the kitchen, and kind of thought, well, my parents are coming back at the weekend, so it's only Monday, I don't have to wash up today. But smoked mackerel pate was delicious, by the way, but Friday night came and I thought, help, Mum and Dad coming back tomorrow, I really ought to do some washing up, and I took the plate off the top of the bowl that had the smoked mackerel pate in. Suffice to say, a good number of flies came out. There was a whole pile of maggots, and there was so much smell that I immediately worried that my parents would smell it the next day when they came in, because it was, well, cream cheese, fish and yogurt, and it had been a lovely hot week. Why am I telling that picture? I think cover up, and if you don't like that phrase, denial, indifference, has effectively been like putting that plate on the bowl in the church. So abuse has happened, and what's happened, not just in the church, but people have suffered in boarding schools or what have you, and the plate has been put on top of that bowl, and we've left it in the sun, not just for a week, but for decades, and failed to acknowledge the trauma that we faced. In fact, trauma can be generational. I've spoken to one victim who has certainly given me evidence of that. And just pause and think about the effect on other people then, that the system has allowed that victim to continue to suffer, and even through no fault of their own, for there to be impact more widely within the family. We need to take that lid off, got to do it. If it's going to smell, don't worry about it, because we need to clean that bowl. And the longer it's been, the harder it will be, the more flies there will be, the more ingrained it will be. Forget it. We've got to do it. That was the analogy that we chatted about, and I think it's important. So the vision would be, let's take the lid off. Let's let the sunlight has been shining, but it's not been shining in that bowl. Actually, the sunlight's been shining to make everything hotter around it. So to fester the trauma, we've been living pretending as if everything's okay, and it's not. So let that light shine in. Let's give people voice. Let's allow them to speak. God speaks the world into being. He gives humanity voice. And is part of what makes us precious and distinctive. And relationship, human beings have relationships that no other creature has. It is what makes us distinctive. And we have voice, and let's listen when people speak. Let's weigh it up. What is good? What is bad? let's acknowledge where people have been through. Again, God says, he looked at everything that he made, he saw it was good. God has the ability to weigh up right and wrong, and we do too. We know when things are right and wrong. Let's acknowledge that. That would be a vision where that happens more and more and more in a place which is safe, where we're able to do that, where it's not, well, no, everywhere is different, so it's not apartheid, truth and reconciliation, but it's ours. It's what we've had in this country, and we've actually denied it. And I think that's been part of the sadness, and everyone's experiences will be very different, and there'll be many that will have really loved it and just won't see it, and you know what, that's great. But please, if it's been your experience that it's been absolutely wonderful, then recognize that there are some for whom it's not been great. And that ought not detract from your enjoyment or all the benefits you've had, but actually use all that you've enjoyed as a way of, and therefore presumably making you as strong to be courageous and to hear those who've not heard or been heard. So that would be a vision, and I think only as we do that, it'll take time. We probably could do it a lot more quickly than we are, because more people will be involved, and that will take us a long time to do. Do you know what? We'll never properly, fully sort it. But if we keep going and we keep trying, we're on the right track.
Thank you, Carl. And yeah, please do, if I can support in any way, connecting people or supporting with something like this, then please do let me know. I think it's a great idea, really do, and so needed. Having that voice, as Nick Duffell's done with his work, just this is what happened. And it kind of brings an idea. I think it's Buckminster Fuller who said, don't try and fix the old system, just create new systems. So it's almost like, let's create these things, not wait for others to do it for us. Because I think that's partly what was happening with ICSA. A lot of people were expecting great things to happen, and nothing really has. I mean, one of the people I've been speaking to about coming on the podcast, who's done Mandate Now, is that at the moment, there's no mandatory reporting for child sexual abuse in boarding schools, in private schools. And the ICSA, they were hoping would change that. And the ruling that, it's the preliminary ruling, there's going to be a final one in the summer, has said they're not going to change it. It's still it's not mandatory. There's a choice whether the school or the institution actually speaks up about what's happened. It's their choice. They can either deal with it inside or bring the police in or some outside body. So it almost feels like great idea. Let's just, begin.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Beautiful.
So there'll be a number of things, and I think if there's one big, I mentioned it slightly beforehand, but almost to finish, one big thing to an area of needing to address is to say it's not just the leadership. So think, to be sort of give an example and specific, think of a church where the minister, the vicar, has been an abusive bully. And he's bullied people, he's bullied people around him. He's exceptionally gifted. People have learnt loads from them. Often, pretty much always are, because otherwise they wouldn't get away with it, get to where they are. But they've bullied people around them. It's not just the elders, the church council. It's not just those people who've kept the person in power and kept them abusing. It is the whole body. Because there will be people within the church family who will see it and say, yeah, that's not right. And yet they've And because they've been crushed and silenced, they actually become part of the problem because they're silent when they could have been part of the solution to say, come on, we ought to do it. So it is the whole body. And I think that's a really important thing, because it's in a school situation, it's not just the head teacher or a teacher, it's the whole staff culture. It's what you allow to get away with. It's what you laugh at. I was in Chichester Diocese beforehand and remember reading a report that they did a few years ago of things that had gone wrong, and people would laugh about a priest and were saying, oh, hasn't he been a naughty boy? And they'd laugh. Well, that a culture can allow that, and that no one can say, whoa, that's our problem. And it's far more than one person doing something wrong. It's we've all played a part in allowing things to happen under our noses. Johnny Linton, says it, and no one listens, but is crushed. And I remember hearing that as a recording, but I wonder whether even he wished he'd said it in a bit more. But the trouble is, the whole country had dismissed him for other reasons. You either loved him or you hated him. And that's the problem. There was antagonism rather than, come on, let's speak truth about what is love. Yeah.
Maybe that's another conversation. I've read quite a few of the ICSA reports about Chichester because one of the bishops used to visit our school. So yes, it's very sad that it was just covered up and for decades. So. Well, thank you. I realize you've got another meeting, so I just really honor your courage in speaking up, because not many people are speaking up, and I think having someone like you just share that we need to open up this lid. It needs to come off. So thank you. I think you're doing amazing work, Carl, sorry. You're Peter Sunderland.
I know Peter, but I think, and I'll probably, just if anyone's listening, I'm no bigwig. I'm just a little old vicar somewhere, well, not so little, but just I'm nobody. But actually, in a way, that's the point. I'm not a name. I'm not a conference speaker. I'm not but we need more people like that to speak. Lots of nobodies actually are the answer. More than just one, and not just in the church, but wherever you are, whoever you are, be a nobody, but be a nobody with a voice and a care and a concern. So Piers, thank you as well. I have appreciated some of I haven't listened to all 34 previous ones. I have.
Tuans Opperman is another amazing one. So a head teacher in South Africa who worked in boarding schools, talking about duty of care, very much what you were talking about, not the institution at the top, but the child, the pupil, their well-being at the top rather than the institution. So yes, really lovely to speak to you. And people, if they want to reach out, please do. Carl's, I'll put your website in the bottom if you want to help in any way. And if any priests would like to join, Carl, great stuff. Cool. Okay, well,
farewell.
Thank you very much, Carl. Take care. Bye-bye.